Prospect House Media.
And now, prepare yourself for the only weekly podcast you won't want to miss. Welcome to the Ameritocracy Show with Troy Edgar, live from our studios in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C.
Hey everybody, I am Troy Edgar and welcome to the Ameritocracy Show. Thank you for tuning in and checking it out. It is greatly appreciated. This podcast examines the conditions for personal and professional growth and opportunity across America. Welcome to another episode of the Ameritocracy, Building a Nation. This week we're exploring Henry Ford in our Building a Nation series. I will discuss today Henry Ford's life and his work and the profound effect that he's had on society, shaping industries, transportation, and even the concept of work itself. It's important to explore the achievements and success, but I also would like to talk a little bit in this episode about providing a fair perspective on trying to understand Ford's shortfalls, blemishes, and flaws. We all have both. So if I piqued your interest in our subjects, hopefully you'll go and explore it more on your own. For example, I highly recommend the book actually written by Henry Ford in 1922 called My Life and Work. And in this episode, I'm going to talk a lot about this book because very few times when you get to do research of a historical figure at this level and the person actually wrote their own their autobiography, and they were able to kind of put it into their words. And so you can read everything about this person, and then you can kind of actually hear their voice. I thought that this was a super helpful reference for me in a fascinating book that really helped me understand Henry Ford in his words. Henry Ford was born in the middle of the Civil War in 1863 to William and Mary Ford in very humble beginnings, growing up on a farm in Dearborn, Michigan. His dad was actually born in Cork, Ireland, and I thought that was interesting, first-generation Irish. He showed an early interest in mechanics and machinery. A very important event in his life happened when he was only 12 years old. His mom had just passed away. Him and his dad were on a trip, and he encountered first large mechanical farm equipment, steam-driven farm equipment in action. And he realized the machine could actually take the hard labor out of farming. He began thinking, how could he create something smaller that would move people around and maybe more efficiently over a greater distance? From that day forward, he created a workshop and made tools and took things apart and put them back together. His mechanical reputation was established when he took a watch that he was given as a gift from his father, and he was able to pull it apart and actually put it back together. This was very similar to what the Wright brothers did in their path to the development of the first airplane. Henry Ford graduated from 8th grade, never attended high school, and like Rockefeller, took bookkeeping classes to better understand finance. At 15, he constructed his first steam engine and then eventually left home at 16 to begin working as a machinist in Detroit. He was always setting up a workshop and continuing his interest in creating the automobile as kind of a side gig. In 1888, when Ford was 25 and about to be married, his father offered him a large portion of the farm to work and help build a house to start his family if he would just stop his hobby. 3 years later, in 1891, Ford went on to leave the farm and go back to Detroit to become an engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company. Even there, Ford always balanced his day job and his side gig, focusing in the evenings and the weekends on the creation of the right small combustible engine and eventually power a cart that would effectively replace the need for horses. He was working on the automobile. At this time, it was also important to understand that there were a lot of other people focused on developing automobiles, and it was becoming a little bit of a race to who would be, first to not only just create a vehicle, but to get it out to the mass populations. At the time it was being created, it was something that if it was finished, it would only be something that people very wealthy would be able to afford. They all caught up in dealing with similar issues in the development of the weight of the car, the size, the dependability, types of fuel, engine, and drive innovation. In 1896, Ford attended a meeting at work where he worked at the Edison Illuminating Company and actually got to meet Thomas Edison. You can imagine he's at a networking event and he pulls Edison aside and he says, I just need a few minutes with you. And I can totally relate with this happening. People do this. They've got a great idea. Edison listened to him. And at the end, he looked at him and he encouraged him to continue his automobile experimentation. It was interesting because at this point, Edison was really focused on electrical power and trying to use electric energy to power everything, including potentially automobiles. But he had told Edison at that time, there's room for both of us. There's a definite need for a small combustible engine. And from that point on, a lifetime friendship was established, and they would stay together and continue to do stuff together for the rest of their lives. He eventually developed his first self-propelled vehicle called the quadricycle, and he then went off to start a couple companies that either failed or he left after seeing them struggle with trying to create a market or a brand. During this period, as Ford was seeing that it was very hard to kind of get a brand out there, he started getting interested in racing. And there would be a lot of races going on in the Detroit area. As I said, a lot of different companies were building cars, and kind of as early proving grounds, they would put them out on racetracks and race against each other, and the media would pick it up and cover it. And so it became something that a lot of people would start to focus on. And it wasn't necessarily the use that Ford hoped that the car would have in racing, but he did see it effective. It drew a lot of people. So what Ford ended up doing is he ended up building a couple cars and entering them into races. First, he actually was the driver, and then he brought in somebody that was a lot more, probably more of a risk taker. And that person was not afraid to go all out and go all in. And so through that process, Ford started to realize, hey, these are 2-cylinder cars. He added two more cylinder to make 4-cylinder and eventually 6-cylinder. And a lot of this stuff was happening behind the scenes. And the first time these cars with this extra power would show up would be on a racetrack, and he would end up lapping people. And so he ended up building a pretty big reputation. And 3 years later, after doing that, he ended up getting funding and starting the Ford Motor Company in 1903. And at that point, he was able to use racing to promote superior innovative products and put it out there, eventually leading to a lot of different types of technological innovation, which I'll talk in a little bit. The breakthrough for Ford is after, again, 1903, he forms a company. He's realizing that there's a lot of combination between how could I make cars for two types of people. One is probably the upper class that can afford really elaborate cars that were more fancy, and cars that were more affordable that the people could afford, and make it just more of a situation into society to be able to introduce the car. He had a breakthrough in 1908. He ended up developing the Model T, and eventually the Model T was a significant impact to the automotive industry. A little bit about the Model T is it was designed simple, durable, and very easy to repair. What he realized is that when people bought something, he almost looked at it like a service, and he wanted to make sure that when you bought something, that it was something that you could take care of. And if you couldn't take care of it, when he started to realize that the market was out there, and he started the innovation of starting what we would call franchise or dealerships, he would basically require these dealers to be able to have the capability of working on the cars. And that was a continued service when you got the car, that it would be able to be worked on by somebody that knew what they were doing. He also, the Model T featured the 4-cylinder engine, 3-speed manual transmission. It was simple, an open top body so you could work on it. And it wasn't luxurious, but as a lot of the other cars at the time, but it was practical and affordable. And then he offered the car in a single color, black. And I think so early on, when Ford started to go into making a car more affordable to the people, he's made sure that he stayed with limited options to keep the costs down. And then through that process, he really wanted to make sure that the cost drove the cost of the car, not the a price or like a thought of luxury, because he wanted to try to just make the car as affordable as possible to get it out to the general population. Ford implemented the system that we've explored a lot on this show called vertical integration, which, I've used it in the Hyundai example when we had Dan Nelson on from Hyundai Automotive in here, which really allowed him to take control of every aspect of the manufacturing process. So, he would work with raw material suppliers, he'd work with parts suppliers, the manufacturing and the combination and the assembly of the car to the final product, and then eventually into the dealerships. And like I said, the service and the parts that would be available there. He also got very focused on the use of publicity. So in Detroit at the time, which was considered the kind of the place to be for automobiles and automobile manufacturing, all the newspapers carried stories and ads about the Ford products. So he was able to learn early on, very different than Rockefeller that we explored in the last Build a Nation, where eventually Rockefeller caught on to how important media could be. Ford caught on to it very quickly, and that was probably because of all of his time studying it through the racing, and he was really promoting it at that time through the newspapers by trying to get notice. At this point now, the Model T in mass production was starting to hit unbelievable numbers and get out to the general population. I said I was going to explore some of the flaws of Henry Ford. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about some of his anti-Semitic views that he had published in his time. In the Ford company, the Ford Motor Company, as it got up and off the ground, he started kind of having interest in a couple different things. And one of the areas of interest was a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, and a book that was out there published called The International Jew. And, again, this is just my perspective on the research, but it seemed that, very opinionated guy, a little bit hard to get along with. You'll see that in the way that as he went through and set up his company, as soon as it started to be successful, and he started having differences of opinions with people around him, he started buying up all the shares, basically almost privatized and move it out of a publicly traded company into being a private company. And I think some of the opinions that we start seeing that are anti-Semitic is when we start getting closer to the wars, World War I, and eventually World War II, you'll see him coming out and making opinions of why he thinks some of the wars were starting and who was really at the heart of it. And so that's something that if you want to explore a little bit further, I would say there is a lot of reference on that. And I just want to kind of talk a little bit about this. This was not a perfect man, like a lot of the other folks that we've evaluated on the show. But again, I think just trying to learn that, trying to pick some of the good from the bad and then realize the bad so that we don't repeat that stuff, I think is really important. Kind of fading back into the story, the use of the production line and assembly line. So 1908, at that time, the Ford Motor Company, and this is what I find fascinating being in consulting, because the thing that Ford realized was that he, at the base, they used to assemble these cars one at a time at a workstation. And it would take, in the biggest day possible, they got up to the numbers of about 25 cars a day. To be able to produce, and they were starting to hit huge numbers. So realizing that 25 cars production was not going to be able to keep up with demand, what they had realized early on with the Model T is not too long into the production of the Model T, they had to stop taking orders because they had so many orders and such a backlog and trying to get these done. So Ford, being this mechanical guy that would like to go and re-engineer and look at process and how things are built, is he started to have an inspiration for what he called the assembly line. And he got that idea from watching meatpacking plants where, he would sit there, he'd go and check these out, and he would see carcasses moving around along conveyor belts, and the workers performed specific tasks at each station. And he adapted this concept into the automobile production, created a moving line, which is what they called it, where the cars were built in stages, and each worker performed a single and repetitive task. As they were able to kind of go through, and again, I would just ask you to check out the book, his autobiography. He talks a lot about the details of how he took each part, and started looking at how can I increase production speed, like the speed of the assembly line. How long do people need to do one thing? Could I put all the parts and have them delivered alongside that workstation so that person didn't really have to move? And then, just to kind of give a little bit of a balance, is that he also created a work environment where, he tried to find jobs for every type of person. So it wasn't just like the able-bodied. He employed blind people. He employed affirmed people that couldn't move. He would see where they could best fit on the line. And if it was something where they could do sitting down and put something together and move it along the process, these people were able to be put into kind of what he called an efficient day of work. And so that, as he had a lot of developments out there, and like I said in the book, it talked about how he was able to increase production astronomically. And those are the innovations that kind of started to follow across a lot of different industries, as we know. He was very opposed to war. And so the Ford company, as I said when I talked about some of his flaws, as World War I came, he adamantly came out and opposed the war. And he started kind of getting involved with groups that were, really fighting for peace. He just, he had a hard time with trying to see the need to kind of go after him. He thought that all these things could potentially be brought to some sort of a negotiation where people wouldn't have to be killed. Through World War I, the government came to him, and he eventually, saw what was at stake and jumped in and actually started building a bunch of different things for the military: airplanes, tractors, cars, even took a shot at ships, anti-submarine tracking ships, when they were starting to have problems doing the cross-Atlantic crossings and having problems with submarines taking out ships. So at that point, Ford was very focused on, trying to help. But as soon as the war came to an end, he immediately shifted back into getting out of that business and back into other, manufacturing of car and advancing his product moving forward. A couple things that I just want to leave you with for other innovations that were concepts. In a lot of the literature that you find on Ford, you'll hear him reference to as Fordisms. Where he really kind of influenced industrial practices. He was one of the first people that came up with the 5-day work week, instead, of working people 7 days a week and having conditions that you would hear about if you do studies on mining and some of the other hard kind of agrarian type traits or industries that were going on at the time, as he tried to offer a 5-day work week. I talked a little bit about the franchise model for dealerships. It was interesting, is like he started, it wasn't just something like you can go and open it up. You can see that model today in the McDonald's, where people come in, they want to be able to have the ability to be representing the company in a local jurisdiction. So they basically take on a region or as part of a city, and they have to bring capital in to help, get the place started. And then they get the full support of the Ford Motor Company or McDonald's, for the example I'm using. But that model for franchise ended up being very successful, and it really helped distribute the Ford product across the nation, and for making sure that the stability and the experience that people would have with the Ford product would be the same, whether you lived in Michigan or in New York City or even out on the West Coast. He also came up with a couple things that were probably, Fordisms that you would take a look at and, try to figure out. The Battle of the Overpass, 1937, where he fought off unions, in the same way he kind of came up with the assembly line, employing a tremendous amount of people in one area. And his viewpoint is kind of looking back up to the 5-day work week and trying to universally employ what he's called welfare capitalism, which is, try to, basically help society by providing a service, and through that service, be able to employ the citizens. He also very much fought off unions, and there's some more to be talked about with his kind of issues with the unions, but I think, this was somebody that, like I said, very opinionated, kind of hard to get along with. He felt like he was already trying to meet people halfway by the reduced work weeks. And then when people would start trying to organize, the Battle of the Overpass was actually a physical altercation where they fought off the unions and really started. And it was a terrible kind of a media PR issue. And, if you look at it from a historical perspective, probably was a pretty important turning point to gave power to the unions and maybe why the unions are so important at the time based on, where you were at and your opinion at that time. If you're a worker, you definitely could see, there could be some benefit. When I start looking at a little bit of the legacy and impact of Ford, I want to look at a couple different areas. First of all, I wanted to look at the way that Ford viewed society and class. This is a guy, like I said, that started in humble beginnings in Dearborn, Michigan, out on a farm. And now he's worked his way into, when he started the Ford Motor Company in 1903, he was 40 years old. So this is a guy, if you think about it, at, the first part of his life, he's doing jobs that he doesn't really like, but he's doing it because he's got to make money and support his family. Sounds a little familiar for a lot of people that listen to this show that always want to try to aspire to do stuff while you have a really good job while you're working it. And so this is an example of somebody that was up till, like I said, 40 years old, still working for other people and doing nights and weekends on his side gig. But the reason why I think it's important to look at this from society and class from his perspective is that now this is a guy that's now very wealthy. By the time, 1908 with the Model T, by 1913, he's mastered the assembly line. He's taken his company back, 100% ownership. He's, after World War I, he's branching out into a lot of different types of things outside of automobiles, like tractors, et cetera, airplanes. So he starts having a view of what it is to be rich and what it means to be poor. And I thought, it was interesting is that some of the literature and references that I went through is, he said there's really no fixed classes. In the end, somebody must do the work. And he kind of used the example of, there's rich people that have become poor and there's poor people that have become rich. But he believed in, if a society was made up of millionaires, just to be extreme, that there, that probably wouldn't be much of a different society than it would be if, as it was of the day. And, trying to understand that concept a little bit more, his view is that, like, even if everybody was millionaires, somebody would need to raise, the wheat. Somebody would have to bake bread. Somebody would have to make machinery, run transportation. Someone would need to do the work. And, in the end, and this was a very significant philosophical view, is his view was that in the end, there's men that will do the work and there's men that will not. And the employing and the employed are going to be two classes of people that have to be considered, whether everybody is rich or poor. So as he was kind of, had those perspectives, like I said, very strong opinions. And, I can't keep going back enough to the book. Like I said, there was a lot of stuff that I read on Ford, but, to be able to read the book that he published, that I referenced up above, and he wrote it in 1922 when he was probably at the height of his success. He was worth about $300 billion at that time in today's dollars. And he's sitting down writing this book and putting his viewpoints out there. You get a first person. It's not like a lot of the stuff that I had read on Rockefeller, and kind of a researcher's view that was pouring through archives and trying to put it together. It was very raw. I think when you look at his view of wealth, he felt that society, again, was kind of moving away from wanting to be rich and focused on what they could accumulate. And I mean, thinking about that just for a second, like, what did he mean by that? Wanting to be rich, like, in 1900s, when this was taking place, rich meant that you accumulated a lot of money. Like, money was the thing you were working for. You wanted to have that money. You wanted to be able to have that money in your bank. So people that were rich had a tremendous amount of money. They clearly would use the money to buy things. But I think as the industrial age started to gear up and people started to make money and a middle class was formed, it started to be through a lot of the media what people can accumulate. And you see that even today. There's becomes a fuzzy line between what is wealth. And so from his viewpoint in 1922, it was, what could people accumulate? He defined the rich as having money for money's sake. But he also looked at, what we accumulate is useless surplus doesn't really honor us. And, he gave examples of people that accumulate, money, but it really doesn't mean anything. And I thought one of the most important kind of quotes in one of the books that I read was that he says, a human being is a human being. It's nourished by the same amount of food and the quality of food. It's, that the human being, the person is warmed by the same weight of clothing. So whether you're rich or poor, no one can inhabit more than one room of a house at a time. So, his view is like, if you are able to do the basics, at that point, anything that you start to accumulate over the basics is, what he kind of referred to as useless surplus. And, kind of ironic. The guy's very wealthy, very rich, and it's got probably what he would have defined as a pretty tremendous amount of useless surplus. He also talked about really kind of two fools in this world, the millionaire that really believed in hoarding money, that they could accumulate real power. So, if they, really were super successful, that eventually with that success and that money, they would become powerful. And he kind of pitted that against people that were penniless, but they were reformers, that he believed that if they could just take money from other people from one class and give it to another, that the world would be cured. And again, this is from an opinionated man sitting in a position kind of prognosticating on kind of the two extremes for what he viewed. And, so I think where he was at, like he looked at, who adds wealth to the world. You can contribute really through production, through a profession. And maybe for Ameritocracy, that's where we find the middle ground, which is, being able to do what you can do based on your merit, be able to qualify yourself to be able to do work. And, then as a professional, you're rewarded at different levels. So, somebody that maybe works in production in this example for Ford would not make as much as a manager, which would not make as much as a supervisor for that section of a car, which wouldn't make as much as the general manager for the car plant. So I think that is a principle that, I think that he really tried to kind of instill and probably led to some of his perspectives on things. Probably the last part of that is that I think his philosophy on his company was really to put service before profit. And he kind of proved this through his mass production and sales of automobiles and tractors. When he looked at the way he costed out cars, just as an example, there's a tremendous amount of work and study on this topic. And I think, like I said, his deal was what could he make the cost of one car be to him? And it would get down to, he would allocate, so much acreage of a piece of property, the building, how much would it take, all the overhead costs, and basically what we would consider today industrial engineering. He would really try to build these models of how much it costs to make a car. And once he got to what that unit cost was, he would put a, what he called a reasonable profit on top of that. And so he felt that if he was able to do that, when he would go to the market, if he could come up with better technology, and he could do something like that, it would take cost out of the car and actually make the cars cheaper the next year. So he wasn't about trying to come out with new models and keep ramping up the cost. He was like, if I do better, the cost of the cars will come down. I'm still going to make good profit, but I'm going to sell more cars and I'm going to make more money overall. And so I think his perspective of looking at really, what was the most important, which was service. Next, I talked earlier that I was going to mention about his view on labor unions. He viewed unions that they serve a purpose, but warned of drifting missions. And, he, said that the only true labor leader is one that really leads labor to fight for work and wages. and the one that leads labor to strikes, sabotage, and starvation needed to be stopped. And obviously, if you see the Battle of the Overpass that I talked about, you see some of the different historical viewpoints. I think that maybe this was his starting premise. I'm not sure he was consistent with the application of this going through, but these are themes that you see, which he was trying to juxtapose and kind of trying to portray at least a good side and a bad side of unions and how they could potentially help people. The next area I want to kind of go into a bit is the company and really the harmony in his personal likes and dislikes. And when I talk about harmony, what I'm talking about is anybody that trying to build a company from scratch, whether you're a manager trying to manage people and you get to hire and fire people that are in your group, or through attrition, they leave and you get to hire new people and you get to take control over the culture of your organization and try to figure out, how can I make something that is going to really do good work? And he was very straightforward on, that this wasn't a social club. He didn't expect, that he wasn't trying to put this together where people completely were in harmony. Matter of fact, he said, even though you can hardly have too much harmony in business, you can go too far and pick workers because they, are good to harmonize. And what he meant by that is like, if everybody's there just to get along, it maybe starts losing the edge of like, why are we in business? And so there was that harsh view, and he definitely had a reputation of being kind of a tough guy and a tough company to work for because he really kind of just got down to business. He also felt that, there could be so much harmony that there can't be healthy friction, competition and collaboration within each unit. And I think, you look at this today, this is just my opinion, but if you look at companies like Oracle, I've been in the tech business a while, I've observed at arm's length, you see a company that the way that they go to market, the way they sell, sometimes you can just see the way it's set up is set for what I would call healthy friction. You have different parts of Oracle competing for the same types of work within an IT shop within a Fortune 500 company, for example. I used to see that a lot. And I'll just, a healthy friction example I would give you even at IBM is IBM sells technology to companies, and then I'm on the consulting side. And as on the consulting side, I don't have to use IBM technology in my solutioning. Matter of fact, I put myself out as being agnostic. If the technology meets the standard that I'm looking for the client's needs, that's something I'll use. In the same regard is on the tech side that sells software, they can sell the software, but they actually have an internal implementation consulting group that does their work. And they could be incented to be able to utilize them to go to market. In that healthy friction category that I'm using here for Ford is, within the IBM shop is, it motivates me as a consulting side to be able to provide unbelievable capability and have a high success rate for the things that we do on the consulting side, and make sure that if the tech side sells something that they would want to potentially pick us over their internal consulting company. That type of friction, sometimes it's hard to deal with because you think, hey, we're one company. Why are we doing this? But I think what it does is it kind of keeps both sides kind of on their toes, and it really sharpens steel on steel and end up being, a positive thing to have, the healthy friction. I think that, Ford really looked at the workers and he pitied the workers that what he called were soft and flabby, meaning that, that the ones that he felt that always had to have an atmosphere or good feeling around them for them to be able to do their work. And in the end, he said that if they can't lift themselves out of self-reliance on their feelings of how they feel in the work spot, the workplace, that they were failures. And he was very vocal about that. And so you can see today in that work environment that we have, and you juxtapose that, a lot of difference from what you would have seen in the beginning of the 1900s. one of the music quotes that I loved that I had heard or that I had read about Ford was that, he talked about, when he's picking talent and being able to kind of go through, he said that, when, who should be a tenor in a quartet, so when he was talking about picking one person over another, and is it based on merit? And again, kind of going back to the meritocracy viewpoint, he says, who should be a tenor in a quartet? And he says, of course, the man that can sing tenor. So, his viewpoint is that, you want to make sure that whatever the job that you're hiring for, that the skill set and the capability and the credentials meet what the job that you're looking for. And so I think early on, that was something that he thought was pretty important. So kind of closing thoughts on Henry Ford. So, you kind of look at the present modern day observations. I've said, probably the big thing about Ford was his ability to be able to re-engineer things and kind of engineer the heck out of them to take cost out. And I think, when you look at today's modern day, and even, like I said, for me as a management consultant, for the first 20 something years, focusing on the Fortune 500 is, I think, even, almost 100 years later, we're still trying to take the extra cost out of the business, whether it's consolidating organizations to service the entire corporation, like a shared service, whether they're looking at product development or moving product development to a place of lower cost. Those types of things kind of continue to today's modern day. And the assembly line is, and the science behind that, like I said, if you study that, and if you were an MBA student, you had to study it tremendously, you'd see just a significant amount of benefit really kind of started there in the early 1900s. The other observation that I had, and is very appropriate to me doing a podcast while I'm executive at a Fortune 500 company, is side hustles. So, it was just interesting to see Edison working, or not Edison, it was interesting to see Ford working through, until he was 40 years old, really trying to, do the job that he needed to do to support his family and sometimes try to make his dad happy. But in the side, he was doing what he felt passionate about. And, his side hustle of really looking at how could he be an entrepreneur. And a lot of people that I've talked to about Ford, they kind of ask me questions like, did he invent the automobile or did he invent the engine? And I wouldn't say he invented either one of them. I think he tried to find a way to power an automobile. And so a lot of his focus on the technology around the engine was important, the combustible engine. And like I talked about, the 2-cylinder, 4-cylinder, 6. His patent on transmissions, that was another innovation added in 1911. So he was constantly going into looking at how could he do things better and tinkering, I guess is what I'd call, or doing his side hustle. Next is his charities. I think that the way he looked at charities is I think he was really always trying to kind of be careful. I've said it, I talked about this with Rockefeller, I talked about this with JP Morgan, is, I think as he started getting very wealthy, he was trying to figure out how to get involved in philanthropy. And, he, even in the book in 1922 that I read, he had pretty strong opinions on what philanthropy means. And, there's no way to make him a saint because he isn't. But I think, what was interesting is, his view was that charities, like professional charities, once you get to a point where with philanthropy that you start to create an organization to do charitable work in a big scale, you're creating a company. And then pretty soon to do the company, just like in the automotive industry or an industry in general, you have to start bringing in what he would consider the bureaucrats of running, or the technocrats to run the charities. So pretty soon running a charity was a thing. And pretty soon a lot of those charities would be consumed in salaries and costs not going directly to the mission. And so he constantly challenged with examples he would use if people were in a community and there was poor people in the community, reach right out and help them directly. Everybody should be self-responsible to look around in their community or the things that interest you. And instead of just writing a check to an organization, actually go directly to the people and try to deal with figuring out how to help people in the way that where they're at, and maybe depend less on charitable organizations. So I thought that that was pretty interesting, his view of charities and philanthropy. So hopefully today you enjoyed the episode on Henry Ford. And I would just ask in the comments, if you wouldn't mind, if you're interested on other people that you might want us to explore in future episodes of Building a Nation, maybe you would enter that in or send an email to our email at our website at troy@troyedgar.com. And we will make sure that we kind of take a look at that and put that under consideration going forward. I wanted to thank you guys for listening to the show, and I hope you enjoyed our assessment today on Henry Ford. Thank you very much. Thanks again for joining me today on the Ameritocracy Show. Be sure to follow me on social media and our website at troyedgar.com, where you can get more information and sign up for my weekly email. I hope you have a great week.